The young corporal's voice had the particular edge of someone who had just been handed a clipboard and told it made him important. "Sir, this platform is restricted. CF-18 Support Unit Transit, authorized personnel only." He said it the way recruits say everything in their first 6 months, loudly, with the word authorized carrying most of the weight, as though the word itself were a wall. Offer. The man he was speaking to did not appear to hear him, as Epsy heard perfectly well, and simply found the information irrelevant. He was standing near the chain-link perimeter of the tarmac staging area at CFB Trenton Stations Fields, hands tucked into the front pockets of a canvas work jacket the color of old pine bark. He was somewhere past 65, built low and wide through the shoulders, the unhurried stillness of a man who had spent a great deal of his life waiting in places far less comfortable than this. His face was deeply lined, not unpleasantly so, the kind of weathering that comes from years of cold wind and decision-making under pressure. His hair, white and cut short, sat flat against his head. Or no hat. He carried no bag. He had simply appeared the way certain men do, without explanation, without announcement, as though the space had been expecting him. Behind the corporal, us military working dogs, and their handlers occupied the staging area in disciplined formation. Animals were Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds, drawn from 3 different units, now being consolidated for a joint exercise rotation. They were loaded out in working harnesses, Asian fields. Calm and professional, in the way that Tier 1 K9 assets are always calm and professional, coiled, present, focused. They had been briefed in the way dogs are briefed, through the steady hands and settled energy of their handlers. Everything was in order. Until the man in the canvas jacket appeared at the fence line. It started with the dog nearest the perimeter, a large male Malinois, call sign Kodiak, assigned to Master Corporal Steph Lapointe, out of Petawawa. Kodiak was not an animal that was easily distracted. He had 3 deployments behind him and a temperament that his handler described, with some professional pride, as aggressively indifferent to everything. He didn't bark at thunder. He didn't flinch at flashbangs, as he had once fallen asleep in a helicopter during a turbulent crossing over the North Atlantic. Kodiak was not asleep now. He was standing with his entire body oriented toward the fence line, his nose working in short, rapid pulls, his ears rotating forward with a precision that suggested he was triangulating something he could not quite name. A low sound started in his chest. Not a growl, not a whine, but something caught between the two, the sound of a dog whose categories have failed him. Lapointe noticed immediately. She kept her voice level. Kodiak. Fuss. Heel. He ignored her. That, in itself, was a minor emergency. Corporal Darren Whittle, who had been managing the perimeter access roster with the self-important focus of a man entrusted with a clipboard, Old looked up from his paperwork at the old man who still hadn't moved. "Sir, I've asked you twice. This is a restricted staging area. You don't have authorization. I'm going to have to ask you to step back to the public access terminal." He took 2 deliberate steps forward, which was the movement of a man who has been told that physical presence communicates authority. The old man turned his head and looked at Whittle with pale gray eyes. He did not appear impressed, appear threatened. He appeared faintly to be calculating something. "I'm not on the access roster," he said. His voice was low, and even with the slight flatness of someone from the interior of the country, the way people speak when they have grown up with a great deal of space around them. "I know that. I'm just watching." "You can't watch from here." "I can see that's going to be a problem," the old man said, without any particular concern. 3 more dogs had now broken their orientation. A shepherd bitch, named Sable, had turned fully toward the fence and sat down, without being commanded, which her handler, Corporal Yves Tremblay, Shake found so unusual that he simply stared at her for a moment before remembering he was supposed to be doing something about it. Two more Malinois had begun a restless agitation in their positions. Not aggression, not fear, but the specific behavioral signature of animals whose training is in direct conflict with their instincts. The senior handler on site, Warrant Officer Patricia Hume, had been observing all of this from the far side of the staging area. She was 44 years old, 22 years in the military, the last 11 of those in K-9 operations. She had worked dogs in Bosnia, Afghanistan, and 3 years attached to RCMP counter-narcotics fields. She was not a person who required a clipboard to feel authoritative. She had seen the old man arrive 6 minutes ago, watched him the same way she watched dogs. Patiently, without blinking, letting the data accumulate. She noticed the way he stood. Most civilians stand with their weight distributed normally, casual, slightly asymmetrical. This man stood with a very specific stillness, weight perfectly centered, knees fractionally soft, unconscious, ready position of someone who has spent decades in environments where it mattered whether you could move in any direction at a moment's notice. It was the posture of a man in his 60s whose body had never entirely stopped being 28 years old. She noticed his hands. They were large, the knuckles prominent, the skin across the back of them traced with a network of small, pale scars. One scar in particular, running diagonally across the web of skin between his right thumb and forefinger, was the very specific shape that comes from a leash that has gone taut suddenly, at high speed with a large animal at the other end of it. She noticed that he was not looking at the situation the way a curious civilian looks at things. He was not watching the handlers, the equipment, the aircraft on the adjacent apron. He was watching the dogs, those watching them, with the systematic attention of someone conducting an evaluation. His gaze moved from animal to animal with brief, precise intervals, pausing at each one long enough to absorb something, then moving on. He wasn't lost. He wasn't a security concern, as doing something she recognized, because she had done it herself many times, standing on the other side of a fence. He was reading them. The situation accelerated before she could cross the staging area. Kodiak, who had been containing himself with impressive restraint for approximately 4 minutes, made his decision. He did not bark. He did not lunge. He simply sat down, facing the fence, threw his head back slightly, and produced a single, sustained note. Not a howl exactly, but something older than a howl, something that resonated at a frequency that was more felt in the chest than heard in the ears. It was the sound of an animal broadcasting something important on a channel that humans mostly cannot receive. The effect on the other dogs was immediate and total. In seconds, every animal in the staging area had oriented toward the fence line. The discipline formation dissolved, not into chaos, but into a kind of urgent, collective attention. Dogs that had been in perfect working calm were now vibrating with something that their handlers had no framework for. Handlers were kneeling, using low voices, hands on the animal's sides, every tool in their considerable repertoire. It wasn't working. The dogs were not disobedient and not aggressive. They were simply operating on different information than the humans around them, receiving a signal that their handlers could not hear, yet responding to it with everything they had. Whittle spun around, his clipboard now irrelevant in his hand, and looked at his dogs with the specific alarm of someone whose competence is being publicly interrogated. "What is happening?" he said. To no one in particular. "I'm trying to figure out," Lapointe said, her voice tight, not looking up from Kodiak. Whittle turned back to the old man. "I don't know how you're doing this," he said, and there was a new quality in his voice now. The hardened edge that comes when authority starts to feel genuinely threatened. But you need to leave. Right now, are classified military assets, and you are interfering with a federal operation. The old man had not moved, just watching the dogs, with an expression that was not amusement, not satisfaction, not anything that Whittle could easily name. It was something closer to recognition. Yeah. The way a man looks when he sees something he understands deeply, and the seeing of it brings a complicated feeling. They're not reacting to me, the old man said quietly. They're reacting to a conflict. What conflict? Between what they know and what they're being told. He glanced briefly at Whittle. It's a harder problem to solve than you might think. Whittle took a step closer, his voice dropping to the register men use when they want to sound more dangerous. I'm going to give you one more opportunity to walk away before I have you detained. I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing, but you are interfering with Whittle. Warrant Officer Hume's voice was not loud. It carried anyway. Gesture. She had crossed the staging area and was now standing 10 feet away, looking not at Whittle, but at the man at the fence. Her expression was the studied neutral of someone who is thinking very quickly and choosing not to show it. Stand down, she said. Whittle turned to her. Warrant, this individual is... I see him, she said. Down. There was a quality to her voice that Whittle, despite himself, responded to. He took a half step back. His clipboard came down. Hume walked to the fence line and stopped. She looked at the old man for a long moment. Your hands, she said. Not a question. An observation offered as an opening. The old man looked down at his hands, then back up at her. One corner of his mouth moved slightly. He turned his palms up briefly, then lowered them again. Long time ago, he said. Not long enough for the dogs to forget, she said. He studied her. Hey, you know the program. I know what was in the historical files when I did my advanced certification. Most of it was redacted. She paused. There was a section on baseline imprinting protocols, bloodline continuity, foundational command architecture. She stopped. I thought it was theoretical. Most of it was, he said. Not all of it. Behind them, Whittle was looking back and forth between his warrant officer and the civilian at the fence with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conversation that is taking place several levels above his current access. The dogs had not settled. If anything, the collective agitation had deepened. Fields. They were organized now in a rough semicircle, all facing the fence, the handlers kneeling beside them or holding their harnesses with both hands, S's showing the specific strain of professionals whose expertise has temporarily run out. These were not green handlers. These were men and women who had spent years building a relationship of trust and communication with their animals. And right now, animals were telling them something that they didn't know how to translate. Warrant Officer Hume turned back to look at them. She looked at Kodiak, who was still sitting at the fence, still produced that low, searching sound. She looked at Sable, who had moved as close to the fence as her lead would allow. She looked at the others, pacing, vibrating, utterly preoccupied with something that she could not see. She turned back to the old man. Settle them? She said. Her voice was direct, professional. She was not asking as a favor. She was asking as someone who had a responsibility and not enough tools to meet it. The old man was quiet for a moment. He looked at the dogs again. His expression was careful. "Didn't mean coming inside the perimeter," he said. Hume looked at Whittle, who looked like he wanted to say several things and was restraining all of them. "Open the gate," she said. Whittle said, "Warrant, all requires." "Corporal Whittle," she said quietly. "Oh, open the gate." There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough for Whittle to calculate whether he wanted to have this argument and conclude that he did not. He moved to the latch. The old man came through the gate slowly. Not because he was cautious, but because he was deliberate. He walked to the center of the staging area with the unhurried movement of a man entering a space that he has some familiarity with, and he stood. He didn't call out to the dogs. He didn't gesture, adopt any visible posture of command. He simply stood the way he had been standing at the fence, weight-centered, utterly still, his pale gray eyes moving from animal to animal. One by one, the dogs found him. Not all at once. Kodiak first. He swung his enormous head toward the old man and went still, the sound cutting off mid-note. Ibel, who stopped her restless movement and sat, her ears upright, locked on him with an intensity that Tremblay had never seen in 6 years of working with her. Then the others, Ishinen, each one finding their way to stillness, to orientation, to that locked, listening attention that dogs produce when they have found the center of the world. The staging area went quiet, not the quiet of resolution, the quiet of listening. The dog was watching the old man with an expression of acute, almost desperate attention. They were waiting. Their handlers knelt beside them, bewildered, not interfering, yet quite sure what they were witnessing. The old man looked at each animal in turn, slow and deliberate, the way a doctor moves through a ward, acknowledging, assessing, present. He saw what they needed, or he had always been able to see what they needed. It was the thing he had never been able to adequately explain in words, and the thing that had made him, for a period of nearly 15 years, among the most effective handlers in the history of the program. He saw dogs that had recognized something ancient and authoritative in him. A scent marker, a posture signature, a way of existing in space that their bloodlines had been responding to since before they were born, had recognized a figure from their deepest training architecture. The way a child recognizes the shape of authority before they can name it. And that recognition, unconfirmed, unresponded to, is ruin. Without the commands that should have accompanied it, had thrown their entire operational framework into uncertainty. They were not broken. They were not afraid, as were waiting for something to make sense. He let the silence hold for another breath, and then, in a voice that was barely above conversational, no command bark, no raised pitch, no projected authority, he spoke 2 words: stand easy. Not in English, Elorhi Fields. In the modified Inuktitut-derived vocal pattern that the program had used to separate baseline commands from the handler's daily language, a second layer of conditioning that lay beneath the working vocabulary, like bedrock beneath soil. Falmon. 2 syllables that meant something closer to the watch is over than any direct translation could carry. A release not of the body, but of the state of readiness. An all clear that went deeper than sit or stay or heel, that reached the part of a working dog's mind where the mission lives. The effect was instantaneous. 12 dogs descended to the ground in the same moment. Not in their handler's commands. Not in response to leash pressure or voice tone. As one, as if the strings had been cut simultaneously, they went down. Not the tight, watchful down of a dog maintaining alertness, but a full, released, deep down, if that comes when a dog has genuinely received permission to stop. Heads on paws, eyes soft, the faint thump of tails against the tarmac, specific quality of stillness that handlers spend months working toward and almost never fully achieve. 12 dogs at rest. The silence that followed, a military working dog complex, on the tarmac of CFB Trenton sounded, for just a moment, like absolutely nothing at all. Whittle's clipboard was at his side. Forgotten it was there. Tremblay was still kneeling beside Sable, one hand on her back, and his hand had stopped moving, the siren of a man. He was staring at her with the expression of a man whose understanding of a subject he has dedicated years to has just been quietly repositioned. Lapointe was looking at Kodiak. Her Kodiak, who had 3 deployments and had never once sat for a stranger. And Kodiak was asleep. Not drowsy, not settling. Asleep with the absolute trust of an animal that has received the signal it was looking for. Warrant Officer Hume turned slowly from the dogs to the man beside her. "What is your name?" she said. The old man had relaxed back into his earlier posture, the stillness receding like a tide, leaving behind only an old man with a canvas jacket and large, scarred hands. "Gideon Carver," he said. The name meant nothing to her. It wouldn't. She knew enough about programs, like the one she was inferring, to understand that the names in those files were not the names the men used afterward. "They headed?" she asked. "Halifax," he said. "My daughter's having her first child, a grandfather." He said it simply, without drama, the way a person announces ordinary, large things. Hume looked at him for a long moment. "The program," she said. "How long?" "Air. Starting in the late 80s. He paused. "They shut it down in 2003. Too expensive to maintain. Too difficult to transfer." Eshin. The knowledge was in the people, and the people were getting old. Something moved across his face briefly, that she chose not to press on. Dogs remembered, though. "They always do. The bloodlines," she said. 4 generations out from the original working stock. Maybe 5, in some of these. He looked out at the sleeping animals. Conditioning isn't genetic, but the receptivity is. They're built to receive that signal. Their grandsires and great-grandsires were trained to respond to it at a level that precedes everything else. "This bear," he paused. "Is her. Meeting me was like hearing a song they knew the melody of, but had never been taught the words to. It was disorienting." Hume absorbed this as a thorough professional, and she absorbed it professionally. "And the command you used," she said, "that's not in any current manual." "No," he said. "It wouldn't be." She looked at him steadily. There were 12 handlers here today who couldn't reach their animals. You walked in and settled 12 dogs in 30 seconds. "I had a head start," he said. "They did most of the work." She turned to face him more fully. "I've been in this branch for 11 years. I've seen exceptional handlers, men and women who have built something real with their animals. What you just did is not something you acquire. You don't train into that." Carver looked at her for a moment. There was something in his expression that was not quite modesty, not quite deflection, something more honest than either. "You do train into it," he said. "You have to start young, and you have to lose some things to get there. Some things you don't get back." He paused. The program asked a great deal of the people in it. It delivered on what it promised. The men and women who came out of it were extraordinary handlers. But it cost them time, relationships, a version of themselves that might have been a little easier to live with. He looked down at his hands. When they shut it down, they didn't do anything for the handlers, just thanked us for our service and pointed us at the civilian world. He said this without bitterness. It was simply something that had happened, the way weather happens. "I bought some land in northern Ontario. Learned to fish. Learned to be quiet in a different way." Hume was quiet for a moment, had moved, without quite being aware of it, to stand closer, not to intervene, to listen. Lapointe was still beside Kodiak, her hand resting on his side, rising and falling with his breathing, just watching the old man. "The dogs being abandoned," Carver said, unprompted, as though following a line of thought she hadn't voiced. "That was the hardest part. The working dogs from the program, when the program ended. Most of them couldn't be rehummed easily. Conditioning that made them exceptional in the field made them complicated in ordinary life." He paused. "We fought for them. Some of us. We got some of them placed. Not all." He stopped. "Get what you can. And then you live with what you couldn't." The tarmac was warm in the late afternoon sun. Somewhere behind them, on the adjacent apron, Asian fields. Ground crew were moving around a Hercules with the methodical efficiency of people who have done the same job for a long time and are very good at it, as her animals. 12 dogs, asleep on a staging area tarmac. entirely at peace, sir. Handlers kneeling beside them in a silence that had stopped being alarmed and become something closer to reverent. She thought about the files she had read, the redacted sections, gaps in the historical record where something had obviously existed and then been removed. She thought about what it meant to build something and then watch the institution decide it wasn't worth the budget line. Thought about all of it. She turned back to Carver. "Before you go," she said, "my handlers, can I have 15 minutes? I'd like them to hear what you just told me." He looked at her, at the handlers, who were looking back at him with the open, careful attention of people who know they have just witnessed something they will not be able to fully explain for years. "Have flight?" he asked. "Not until 1800. He was quiet for a moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and found nothing, realized he had no watch, and glanced at the sun instead. A small, unconscious habit that told her more than anything he had said. 15 minutes, he said. What followed was not a lecture. It was not a briefing or a formal instruction. It was a conversation. The kind of conversation that happens when someone who knows something deeply is in a room with people who are serious about learning, and everyone can feel that the window is limited and the knowledge is rare. He spoke about the difference between compliance and comprehension in a working dog's mind, about the architecture of trust, the way it is built, not through authority, but through consistency of signal, animal's understanding that the information it receives from its handler is always reliable. He spoke about what happens when that reliability is interrupted and a dog encounters a signal it recognizes but cannot place, and how that conflict manifests as what handlers typically interpret as problem behavior. He spoke about the dogs that were abandoned, as he said it plainly, without editorializing. But everyone who was listening heard what was underneath it. Lapointe asked about bloodline conditioning. I asked about the vocal patterning system, and whether any of it had been documented, and whether any of that documentation still existed somewhere. Hume asked about the original animals, foundation stock, and Carver was quiet for a moment before he answered. He said the foundation stock had been exceptional. They were the most responsive animals he had ever worked with, before or since. He said that their grandchildren, and their grandchildren's grandchildren, handler, were doing good work every day in the hands of good handlers, and that there was something deeply right about that, something that went beyond any bureaucratic decision about program funding. Actually, he said the knowledge didn't entirely disappear when the program did, into the dogs, and it went into the people, and some of those people, when they left, took it with them to wherever they ended up and lived with it quietly and did what they could with it. He checked the sun again. "I should go," he said. He looked at Hume. "You have good people here and good animals." He looked at Lapointe, who was still sitting on the tarmac beside Kodiak. "That dog trusts you completely. Ever mistake his capacity for trust for a reduction in his capacity for anything else. He does what he does for you because you've earned it. Don't take shortcuts with that." Lapointe nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something and couldn't find the right size of words. Carver looked, briefly, at Whittle. To his credit, he said nothing that would have made the corporal's afternoon worse. He simply gave him a small, neutral nod. The nod of a man who has been in enough situations to know that most people are doing what they think is right with the information they have, and that this deserves some acknowledgement even when the information is incomplete. Then he turned and walked back toward the gate, moving the same way he had moved when he arrived. Without hurry, looking back, one foot in front of the other in the direction he was going. He stopped at the gate, turned just slightly. "Tell them to listen to the dogs," he said. "Not just to what the dogs do. To what they're trying to say. There's a difference." The second one takes longer, but it's the only thing that actually works. Hume held up one hand briefly, and he saw it. He walked out through the gate, back into the civilian side of the world, back into the unremarkable stream of people moving through CFB Trenton on an ordinary afternoon in May of old dusty fields. And within a moment he was simply a tall, white-haired man in a canvas jacket heading to the domestic terminal to catch a flight to Halifax, to be there when his daughter brought his grandchild home. Hume stood at the fence and watched him go. Whittle came to stand beside her, his clipboard quiet at his side. "Says he?" Whittle said. "I don't know his file," Hume said. "I know his work." She turned back to the staging area, to her handlers and their animals, to the 12 dogs who were beginning to stir now, stretching, looking up at the handlers who had been beside them this whole time, with the clear, uncomplicated trust of animals who know exactly who their people are. Thing that had come apart, had come back together. A handler who had been on that tarmac would spend the next 20 years of their career carrying something they hadn't arrived with that afternoon. A question they would keep returning to, empty fields. A recalibration in how they understood the animals beside them. A reminder that the knowledge a person builds over a lifetime is not nothing, does not become nothing. Even when the institution that created the conditionals for it decides to move on. On the adjacent apron started its engines. The dogs looked up, ears rotating indifferent. LaPointe put her hand on Kodiak's neck. He leaned into it, and they got back to work.